The Holy Scriptures according to Revelations chapter 21. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more. For the first things have passed away." And the one who was seated on the throne said, "See, I am making all things new." Also he said, "Write this, for these words are trustworthy and true." And then he said to me, "It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give water as a gift from the spring of the water of life. Those who conquer will inherit these things, and I will be their God, and they will be my children. But as for the cowardly, the faithless, the polluted, the murderers, the fornicators, the sorcerers, the idolaters, and all liars, their place will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death." This is the word of God. Thanks be to God. I feel like that last line requires a stomp. Well, during my summer leave this year, I was fortunate to be able to spend some time on the Bruce Peninsula. And on one of the days that I was there, Marlon and Brad did a hike with me, and we went swimming. Anyway, I hiked a number of segments of the Bruce Trail on the peninsula this year. How many of you are familiar with the Bruce Trail? Okay, a few hands. So it follows the escarpment roughly, and therefore it has lots of places where there are rocks and little crags in the rocks. And if you know anything at all about snakes, you know that snakes like to warm themselves on rocks. And this summer being the somewhat weird summer that it was, not just on account of the pandemic, but weather in general, those snakes, I think, found themselves really keen on getting out on the rocks to get warm because the nights were so cold. And during the time I was on leave, I tried my best to immerse myself in nature as much as possible. And I did a lot of hiking, and I left as little of the news as possible to look at, and I focused on listening closely to God. So hiking and swimming in the Georgian Bay waters were the ways in which I sought to replenish myself. Now, aside from listening closely to God, after one hike when I encountered a Mississauga rattlesnake fully rattling, I also began listening very closely for rattling sounds. And over the many, many years that I've hiked the Bruce Trail, I always knew Mississauga rattlers were a thing, but I have never encountered even one before this year. And on the hike that I did with Brad and Marlon, we had a particularly memorable moment where Marlon and I stopped to observe a particular plant, and I heard a sound, and I turned and I said, "Is that a rattlesnake?" And Brad says, "No, it's a cicada, or it's some bug or something." And we proceeded to look at what we were looking at. And then when we turned to resume the hike, Brad nearly stepped on two snakes that were vigorously involved in the act of preparing to make more snakes. They were rattlesnakes. They were not pleased to have been interrupted, and we wouldn't have realized it was two, except that when we paused, we realized there were more than two snake ends in this pile, right? So we continued our hike, and a little further on there was another rattlesnake. And altogether, there was an abundant show of snakes this summer. I saw over 5 Mississauga rattlers, about 10 garter snakes, and then we also saw a number of water snakes. Now, I come to Canada from Jamaica, and before that from Sri Lanka. Jamaica has like one kind of snake basically, and it's not a poisonous snake. But in Sri Lanka there are all kinds of snakes of various kinds, and many of them are poisonous. So that Sri Lankan heritage brings me very honestly to a very strong phobia of snakes. And I remembered the Gospel of Luke reading that Laurie read for us earlier today, in which the disciples are returning from having been sent out, and they are all excited, and they're talking to Jesus, and Jesus reminds them that they are in charge over fear. Jesus gives authority over snakes and scorpions and evil and the enemy. He gives authority over all danger. Now, I want you to know this did not make me go and step on snakes to demonstrate my authority. It just gave me the peace that I needed to have in order to continue to enjoy the natural environment without becoming overcome by fear. Because when you're out there walking, everything can look like a snake, right? That Luke reading follows the sending of the 70 disciples out into the community. So they've had a bunch of teaching from Jesus, and they are being sent out to tell the good news. And when they return, they are full of excitement at the fact that even demons submit to them. They return from their evangelical visits into all these various new settings where they're received, and they're basically returning saying to Jesus, "It was so cool. We were able to do so many amazing things, like get demons to submit and heal ills. This gospel business sure does provide some cool tricks." I can kind of picture Jesus shaking his head going, okay, they're all about the fanfare here, right? It's in the context of this excitement that Jesus reminds them of two things. The authority granted by God covers all manner of harmful things: snakes, scorpions, evil, and the power of the enemy. The second thing, though, that Jesus reminds them of is that our joy should not be in our authority. In other words, our authority is not what we should be boasting about, but our joy should be that God has included us in this heavenly communion. Our joy should be about inclusion in this heavenly rite, this gathering. Another way of putting this might be to remember that our authority is kind of like the gift wrap. It's kind of like the gift wrap for a much bigger gift, and that bigger gift is being included in the family of God through the love that God has given us in, with, and through Jesus. Now, how many of you have ever been near either small children or grandchildren or babies when Christmas time or birthdays come around and you give them a gift and you're excited about the gift, and they're more preoccupied with the wrapping paper, or maybe the bag and the tissue that it came in, right? If you are familiar with that image, I can picture that Jesus internally is shaking his head when these disciples return and they're all excited about the authority that they have. I think Jesus might be shaking his head and going, how about you notice the gift that's on the inside and not just the wrapper? And so I'm thankful that while hiking on those trails with all those snakes, I was able to focus more on the gift than on the wrapper. I found myself filled with a deep peace despite these encounters with snakes. And that peace came from witnessing in a very bodily and somatic way that the beauty of divine creation for those hours of hiking and swimming, incorporated me into the landscape. I was and am a part of this heavenly communion that is called creation, as are each one of you. This is what it means, I thought as I hiked and I swam. This is what it means to be included in God's kingdom, to be a part of all of this. And this drew me right back to the creation story in Genesis, in which God not only creates everything and declares that it is good, but God grants us authority, putting everything under our power and granting us dominion, or the power to dominate everything that surrounds us. So if you think about it, dominion, authority, and power have given us all kinds of wonders of science. Things like air travel and microbiology and labor-saving mechanization so that we can have the freedom to retire from work and take vacations. And if we didn't have all these things in place, these tools would not have been available to facilitate a global pandemic. Because the last time that something like COVID came along, it was contained in a smaller area because people weren't traveling so much, because there wasn't so much rapid movement between countries. And although I could ignore the news while I was on leave this summer, I could not ignore the anger that would well up inside of me when I'd be walking on the trail and I'd see one of those disposable blue masks laying on the trail. I'm thinking to myself, honestly, like, you can't take that with you when you go. Why do you have to leave it laying around? And I don't think those blue masks are biodegradable, so that just added to my frustration about the whole thing. We have been granted authority and protection. We have been granted dominion and power, which gains us the means to enact protecting ourselves. But then why does it so often feel like humanity has to protect ourselves at the expense of the rest of the planet and at the expense of the rest of creation? And I think this is a good place for the voice of David Attenborough to enter. How many of you have watched or heard any of David Attenborough's productions? I see a couple of hands. So for those of you who haven't raised hands, Sir David Frederick Attenborough is a gentleman who has published an incredible amount of material on the natural world, in film, in writing, in magazines, in other forms of publication. And this year, in 2020, he is in his mid-90s and published a witness statement, which is a film, and it's a vision of the future called A Life on Our Planet. And this film is about 1 hour and 20 minutes long, and it's available online. And in it, Sir David chronicles his own experience with the natural world from the earliest years of his career to the present day. Now, this was a kid who was really interested even in bugs and newts when he was a kid. And at one point, one of the things I read was that the local university needed newts for an experiment, some class they were teaching, and he caught them and sold them to the university, and it turned out he was catching them from a pond that was actually on their premises. Right? So even as a really small child, he knew how to work this nature thing. But if you watch his programs, I remember there was one documentary series of his that I watched, which was about, I think it was sea lions or seals. And there was actually a point in the documentary where I just burst out into tears, because it was showing us how our human encroachment on the natural world was causing these animals to have to literally jump off of cliffs and die, right? So Sir David chronicles his own experience from when he began being a nature reporter, I guess. And you see him really young in black and white in his little safari outfit, hugging snakes and chimpanzees and holding all kinds of odd animals. And then you see, as the years proceed, how those things go. And they give a percentage, as the years pass, they give a percentage of how much of the rainforests are damaged, how much of our production is affecting the environment. And just when you think you get to the age he's at now, and just when you think everything is really on our planet going to hell in a handbasket, Sir David explains how it is possible, with intentional human efforts, to turn back the effects of human influence on our natural world. Not completely, but significantly. And I'm not sharing this as a free ad for film or for any online video service. I'm not even particularly trying to advertise David Attenborough's work. I share it because the film served for me as a potent reminder of hope. In the midst of this week, this year, this era, when we are inundated with difficult and scary news, from pandemic updates to increased opioid and drug use, declining mental health, fires, floods, hurricanes, in the midst of this time when fear and death have become dark, heavy shadows under our eyes, and even bereavement and grieving is convoluted by the fact that we can't sit closely with those who have lost a loved one. We can't hug, we can't hold hands, we can't even breathe freely, what with the masks and all. In this time, I feel a hunger for hope that is very, very deep. And I mentioned David Attenborough's witness statement to remind us of hope, and also to remind us of the power of our own witness statements as people of faith. Because you don't have to have been employed by the BBC for all your life to have a witness story. Each one of us here has a story of our faith that we are able to share. We have a story of how what we believe brought us out of a depth at some point in time, or someone from the family of faith reached out to us when we were in that depth of darkness and helped us to come back to life. And as we think about that, I want us to remember that our witness, our individual witness, may be the best flag of hope available to those who are starved for hope. As people of God, we know that God is the beginning and the end. We know that God is with us, dwelling in our midst, wiping the tears from our eyes and giving the breath to our lungs, washing us in those waters of everlasting life. Now, on trails with poisonous rattlesnakes, littered with non-biodegradable masks, we walk secure in the knowledge of God's protection, knowing God has shared dominion and power with us. We are made in divine likeness after all. And we revel not in the wrapping paper of the powers which the gospel gives us, but rather we revel in knowing that we, each one of you and I, each one of us is a child of God, the gift inside that wrapping paper. Revelation says these words are trustworthy and true. To the thirsty I will give water as a gift from the spring of the water of life. Those who conquer will inherit these things, and I will be their God, and they will be my children. In Jesus we are conquerors of fear. We have authority over evil and danger, and our witness statement is one of hope. Thanks be to God.